Our little clickety-clack opening intro out of the way. Welcome to Evolution Hour on this hot August 4th here in Spokane, Washington. Whee! CartoocanWordPress.com. The Troubles in Paradise Project, the methodology of creationism. Welcome, welcome, welcome. For those who are here and not, we will see what we've got going all in the chat. And we will see who all is here. By myself here for the moment. Maybe. I'm not sure whether or not. Hi, Lisa. Not sure if Jackson will be materializing or not. Replacing Darwin is the main topic of the show for the next interim as I go plowing through source by source by source, in addition to writing volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. Just finished the Leviathan section, now going into medieval illustrations of dinosaurs in the new section. Let me thank our patrons. Let me get that right off the field, just in case we have a screwball linkage here. I thank everybody who has been a patron. It has been wonderfully helpful all the way down the road here. We got our colleagues Hendril, Colton, Eric Rowley, Suris Zeshi, researchers. You see Travis Adams, Ian Chen, Convert Me, Stephen Early, Eat Meal, James Fitzwater, History Miner, Rob McFadden, Apologia, Benjamin Simpson, Speed of Sound, Studio DM Wing, and our assistant researchers, Command Cyborg, Doranku, Jelly, The Lavender Lady, Totus Real, and Christopher Johnson, our friends Steve Bauman, Marigale Beddoes, Daniel, Insects Are Cool, Martin Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Puffalophagus, Bo Halbo, Rasmussen, Devin Reeves, Alex Stone, Paul Williams, and the legacy patrons who helped at one point or another: Jen, Jody, Mike, John, Keith, Andrew, Dyer, Huey, Mona, Brad, Daniel, Nana, Staggle, Sun, Skystone, Ugly German Truths, Everett, Vincent, Sur, Weisbaum. Every one of you has made a difference every week, month, plowing along on this project as a retiree and getting a little bits of book royalties, hint, hint, books, and also Social Security. So, in this air quotes retirement activity of mine, our topics today relate to two disparate areas chronologically. Hi, Scott. What is Jensen wrong about today? Yes. For those who have been watching the old show for the last months, chapter 7 is a big section where Jensen is pulling out the Jensen and relying on his own work, including some unpublished stuff, which, by the way, some of it has never gotten published, where he claims to have conducted the proper analysis of the genetic data fields that are available, which has come up with the idea that the amount of mutations that had the human species been very old would have had a huge amount of mutations, but in fact we have a very small number of mutations, and therefore that's prima facie evidence that the human species is only 6,000 years old. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Problem is that his numbers are junk, as has been noted in previous weeks, that he just gets his primary mutation rates wrong and confuses germline and the main somatic line, and it's just a mess. And he's been criticized on this in quite a ways, and no geneticist seems to be paying any attention to it. But anyway, his latest installment happens to bump into a technical paper again. He had been kind of shying away. He was just presenting a bunch of Jensen for the mass of footnotes, and he brings up African populations, which he's sort of hinting that somehow or other, if there's any variation in the mutation rates in Africa, that somehow this is a problem for evolution and a support for the mutation rate variations that he's proposing, which involve uber large variation. Very good question from Lisa here. What are his qualifications for analyzing mutation rates? Not a hell of a lot. He has a genetics degree, so he's got that part and has had a little bit of publications down the road, as many of the top echelon gang at AIG and ICR and all the rest do. Jensen John Sanford, Georgia Purdom, Robert Carter, all have some credentials in the field. But the point is, this is not their actual field. Sanford is a plant geneticist, and others, so they're not really terribly experienced in this area. Jeffrey Tompkins does sort of technical analysis stuff and still publishes as a co-author every so often from down at University of Georgia. Jensen seems much more peripheral as far as I can see. But the major upshot is that this sort of argument hasn't gained a huge amount of traction even in the creationist community, and certainly has been just crickets when it comes to the regular genetics community. No one's paying any attention to any of this stuff. Anyway, he bumps into a paper from 2011 by Hinch et al., which fortunately is an open access one, so I'm going to be putting a link to that, which is about detecting evolutionary hotspots in West African population and comparing them to American African Americans to be able to kind of check some things. And it's looking like that block is suggesting that there are certain genetic hotspots in the African mix from West Africa that increases the probability that crossovers and coordinations would occur during replication and sexual reproduction that could actually have some downside effects, because a lot of diseases are connected to those sorts of crossovers, and there's little hotspots in there. This wasn't necessarily actually about a higher mutation rate in general, only that certain hotspots were occurring in that population. Well, I then classify that he's not really representing this Hinch paper accurately, because he's just dangling it in a footnote about African populations in general, when this is about a much more specific topic, and you'll be able to see that if you go and read the myth. Hi, creation myths. Yes, Scott, our actual genetics guy, Dan Stern Cardinale, creation myths, can weigh in on this stuff. So if I make any misstatements on this, you can let me know, Dan, because I am but a lowly little drone, a history degree person who is insatiably curious and doesn't know when to shut up. At any rate, what was interesting about this is that in checking up, one of the things you do in source methods is to look up how a thing has progressed over time. So a 2011 paper is a decade ago. It was 6 years earlier than Jensen's book. So what had happened to that? Well, it happens that a technical paper that I hadn't previously been aware of, that came out in 2015 by Lips in 2015, involving also David Reich. He's one of the co-authors on this, where at PLOS Genetics, where they're able to, quote, estimate a long-term mutation rate averaged over, drum roll please, hundreds of thousands of generations, unquote. And this Hinch paper was one of the many works that they were drawing on, because this was basically a meta-analysis that was pulling together huge amounts of information from a lot of different segments. Now, what's funky about this, and Dan, you might even want to look at it when I get the links and all that put in to find out what you think about it, is that you can compare the cartoon nothing that you get in Jensen's analysis of Hinch versus Hinch's own paper, and the Lipson paper drawing on the Hinch work in 2015, 2 years before the Jensen work. And it, in my view, is just reinforcing it. Oh, thank you, Dan. I try to be careful. I proceed under the assumption, and in fact, anybody watching the show should recognize that although technical issues come up, it's not magic. It's never magic. Any human being who's careful and reads and checks up, measuring what you know and what the terminology are, all of this is potentially understandable and knowable. And therefore, anybody who has diligence and care can get a grip on what the issues are and become familiar with them. And I don't think anybody should feel intimidated. Science shouldn't be regarded, and any field, in fact, should not be regarded as an arcane, magical discipline that only those anointed with this can possibly do. No, it's a large range of things. And the history of science is certainly replete with talented amateurs who go way beyond my level. Charles Darwin's in that box, Charles Lyell. I suppose we would also have to throw in Thomas Huxley and others who are, and the guy that was developing continental drift, Wegener. A lot of people are not going through the official initial route because there was no official initial route. Now, of course, I just have a BA in history, and so people who do actually have tenured degrees in the area have a greater gravitas than I will. But everybody can theoretically check out the papers. They can do their own research. They can use the tools of analytical research to burrow around and find the material. And all of that is the buzzword that I preach the gospel of: source methods. Drum roll, boom, 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 boom. That's the underlying core of all of that. Dan and Erica Gutsick-Gibbon and Dapper Dino and Colton, the geologist, and my co-author Jackson Wheat and Paula Gia. So many people are doing source methods. They didn't require RJ to come along and lead them in the garden path. No, they were doing this on their own. It's a simple, basic rule of analytical reasoning. Where are you getting your information from? Is the source a reliable one? Have you worked out what you think happened accurately? Does the information you're presenting, are you fairly presenting it? And does it actually support your argument? All of that. It's exactly the same principle. And you do that in analysis of historical writing, which is actually in some respects harder than the sciences, because Dan never has to worry about some little cytosine molecule cheating and writing a sneaky memoir to make everyone thinks it's a uracil. Oh, we're just trying to puff ourselves up. That doesn't happen in biology. Sorry. Individual scientists might screw up, Jensen being a poster child, but the data are still there and amenable. Whereas in history, we historians have to deal with bullshitting. Pharaoh Ramesses II puts up a gigantic pile of propaganda up on the wall about how he won the battle. Yeah, not quite so accurate when you start looking at the background information. Caesar writes his memoirs of the Gallic Wars. Yeah, how much of that is self-aggrandizing puffery, and how accurate is all of it? And historians have to grapple with all of that same element. Just imagine if you were trying to read the memoirs of Tucker Carlson. You could realize, just because it's written down doesn't mean it's accurate. So that's a thing that the historian has to contend with, that makes it somewhat more complicated than you poor, sad little scientists who all you have to worry about is wrestling nature to the ground, and you don't have to worry about human beings fiddle farting around. Where it comes in, yeah, that is one of the peculiar ironies Lisa points out about how Kent Hovind in particular, you come from dirt. You think you come from dirt, you evolutionists. Except the Bible account. Not of other religions have different modes, but the Bible account talks about from dust. God takes dust in one of the creation stories. And then, of course, the ribectomy that's in the other version. So there's more than one study going on, which, of course, brings up the topic of the provenance of Genesis and how it wasn't compiled from a single narrative. There was no Moses person sitting down writing all the pieces all in one big gush like Joseph Smith writing the Book of Mormon, that it was a compilation over a great deal of time by scribes who we don't exactly know who they are. The provenance is much more complicated on that. So all of that will be discussed in Volume 2 of The Rocks Were There, rest assured. The second part of the show relates, which we're getting to a little bit in fast, and then we'll see. And by the way, any questions and stuff that come along and topics, be sure to come bring them in. I suppose before I get to that second part, I can talk about a potential coming attraction this weekend. It's not detail finalized. It sounds like at 9 p.m. Pacific, the plan is that Leophilus and I will be debating two head up their ass nincompoops on the Titanic and their claims that it was a conspiracy or skullduggery to sink it. And I got to still check if I only got one of the names of one of the people that we'll be debating, and I don't know about the other one. There's several different wacky conspiracy theories that circulate around the Titanic. I have been researching the Titanic for a long time, and it turns out Leophilus is one of these anal retentive Titanic guys as well. So he's been investigating all of that. Harry Wright, what are your thoughts on the elongated skulls of Peru having European DNA? There's really no indication of that. In fact, that's another little topic that's going to be coming in the second Rocks book. That'll be in the human evolution chapter on that. That there's been some detailed analysis of that's been done in the technical literature. There's also a subculture of wackaloons who have been claiming all sorts of crap about it. But there's only a few technical papers that have actually been published on this. And the only thing that's really interesting about it is that culture of Indians that are one of the many cultures around the world that practice deformation, in this case, skulls. And as far as I know, there's no indication whatsoever that there's any European DNA. They go too far back before the introduction of Europeans into America and all that. So, on the Titanic episode, it's a wacky thing because in the pecking order of stupid, the Titanic conspiracy theory is just a teeny tiny little pimple on the back ass of Major League Stupid. They don't seem to follow in, and that's another thing I'll be interested in bumping into the two examples that we'll be debating if this materializes on modern day debate. Is where are they coming from? What other views do they have? Because I don't know exactly where they're fitting. Some apparently of the Titanic conspiracy nuts are coming from good old-fashioned anti-Semitism, the Rothschilds and evil cabals, which ironically goes back to certainly the Nazi era, where they were putting all sorts of screwball stuff out. In fact, there was even a 1944 movie, Titanic, where I bet you didn't know that there was a nice Aryan German who was the first officer on board the Titanic that tried to warn them about iceberg problems. That's the kind of Titanic movie you get when Nazis make Titanic movies. I'm not making this up, by the way. It's been available. I finally, because I'm a Titanic groupie, I have all the different Titanic movies and all that kind of stuff. In fact, a tiny snippet of that movie's special effects there's one brief moment of the Titanic sailing along with little puffy smokes coming out of it. That's actually the model work that was done for the German movie that shows up in A Night to Remember, the 1958 English movie that was made with Roy Ward Baker directing, who went on to do Quatermass in the Pit, the classic science fiction movie. I'm geeking out now on motion pictures. Tiktaalik sunk the Titanic. That would be about as plausible as some of the theories were going. I mean, if you want to come up with conspiracy theories, it's easy to do out of thin air. I could hypothesize that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had a vendetta against Jacques Futrelle, the mystery writer, and arranged for the ship to sink to kill him because he was writing the Thinking Machine stories. It's nonsense, but that doesn't stop him any. The spoiler alert on the idea, one of the conspiracy theories has to do with the insurance argument and the claim that the Olympic was actually sunk instead of the Titanic for insurance purposes. There's a tiny spoiler alert problem on this. It's stupid because the two ships aren't identical. And anybody who's a real Titanic buff can instantly tell the two apart from a photograph or deck plan. And anybody who had been on the ships, and there were people who had been on both ships. There were stewards and stuff, various people that had worked on Olympic, that had worked on the other ship, and would have continued to know about what was going on as the Olympic lasted all the way down into the 1930 or so when it was scuttled. By that time, it was on the cruise line surface because all of those old pre-war ocean liners were getting really fuddy-duddy after World War I, and the new gigantic 45,000-ton ship sounds really impressive at 1912, guys. But 1925, it's not cutting it. If you're not 950 or 1,000 feet long with 60, 70, 80,000 tons, you just ain't nothing anymore. That's how fast ocean liners shifted, and everything was now Art Deco modernism. So all of that frilly Victorian style of vessels in the pre-war period were just looking drab compared to the Normandy and the Ile-de-France and the Bremen and all the other modern ocean liners that were coming along, or even the super cinema style of the Queen Mary in 1936, you know, which you can see down in Long Beach before it capsizes. They've been having problems with the poor thing. It's sad that we go on. Anyway, that will be theoretically on the weekend. So back to part two. Kenny Hunter said the Olympic and the Titanic are identical. No, they are not, Kenny. And I think you need to look into that. You can easily tell from the upper deck promenade, because the Olympic is small openings all the way down because it's open. The Titanic has first-class passenger compartments all the way along. I could bring up my model in that and show everybody. And the deck plan looks quite clearly different. And the interiors are different. Linoleum was commonly used in a lot of the public rooms in the Olympic, including the dining room, but not so on the Titanic, where it was carpeting. They were going upscale. The interior decor was different. The smoking room on the Olympic was not the same design as the smoking room on the Titanic, and so forth. So Kenny, who, by the way, is a young Earth creationist oddball, this is yet another subject to put on your little spindle of things you need to research in order to pay some attention. Yeah, Lisa, troll alert. Yes, he's Kenny. Kenny has never... if he is not a troll, he's doing a fabulously good impression of one, and he has never conveyed any information of any sort whatsoever that is useful to anybody in any of the various conversations. So he's the negative number of a person in a discussion, and he's not alone. There are a lot of people that are just as pointless in these areas. But get a grip. It's the 21st century. This information is available. But if you aren't armed with a sound method, Kenny, you're going to screw up again, and you're going to misunderstand stuff. So you need to recalibrate your core method about how you process information to be able to reliably assess things like reality. So anyway, part two, uncommon descent. For those of you who have lived in a cave or have been blissfully unaware of the intelligent design movement, and you're better for it, uncommon descent. Is Kenny also a flat earther? I don't know. Kenny can tell us. I can't. I don't have my notes up on Kenny to look into it, but it would not be totally surprising if he were. Anyway, uncommon descent. It started out as kind of Bill Dembski, the specified complexity information theory guru at the intelligent design movement. Is his personal website, and he's kind of retired from it now, so other little minions operate it, and it's still a going concern. Anyway, a posting has just come along quite recently where they're riffing off a paper by Borsdag et al. 2021, which happens to be open access, so I'm going to be putting the links to both of those in due course, which is about the Great Oxidation Event. Bum, bum, bum. If you don't know what that is, that's the time when, especially, but not necessarily only, cyanobacteria were coming on the field biologically. And they were producing, as a farting byproduct, oxygen, which as we all know, is a terribly corrosive, dangerous substance, and also incredibly reactive. And it wants to link up with anything around. It promotes combustion, too. So you don't want your atmospheric oxygen to get too high because it increases forest fires and a whole bunch of other things. We currently run at about 21% oxygen. It's dipped as low, I think, as 14% during the Triassic after the Great Permian mass extinction. And it's got as high as maybe 50%-ish during the Carboniferous. That way you could have great big bugs that since bugs breathe through their skin, they can just lap up that high oxygen level. It also had some other side effects and things in terms of biology. But anyway, we're talking way earlier in the Great Oxidation Event, billions of years ago, that producing oxygen is initially being bumped out into oceans. And gradually, oxygen is reacting with stuff. It's not really getting into the atmosphere yet. That's later on, when it's run out of things to react with in the oceans. And the first big thing it's reacting to is free iron. And this is called rust. Iron oxide is forming. And most, not all, but most of the great iron deposits around the world were formed during the Great Oxidation Event, as basically the cyanobacteria's oxygen farts are rusting out the oceans and settling these monstrous beds of iron deposits all over the place. Oxygen continues to go into the environment and eventually is starting to increase its oxygen level in the atmosphere and break down, producing ozone, which is changing the dynamic of ultraviolet light and all this. Anyway, the issue then has to do with what impact did all of this stuff have on when multicellularity develops, which seems to be way far down the road, in the earliest stages of which are occurring about 1 billion years ago, which is about 1 billion years or so after the Great Oxidation Event, and then another 500 million years or so before you hit like the Cambrian explosion. What's going on here? Well, this paper is actually really quite interesting because it's going on about that transition from an aerobic dominated biology to an anaerobic one to an aerobic one, where oxygen is being used actively by organisms, actually had elements to it that were counting against developing multicellularity. And the point of this paper is they're not having to guess. They were able to do selection analyses on yeast to see how the aerobic versus anaerobic systems were running in terms of fitness and multicellularity, clumping tendencies, and a whole bunch of other stuff. That's what this new paper is about. Now, our gang at Uncommon Descent insist on dumping on this paper in their usual way, and you can read the links in that to it, where they just don't get the point about what the heck is going on here. And this exposes, in my view, the fundamental flaw in the intelligent design concept. Kent thinks the Earth always had oxygen because of amber. Isn't he precious? Oh, amber's so far down the road. Woo! But that's what happens when people don't have a functioning map of time. You know, they're completely screwball on this kind of stuff. Anyway, that oxygen is a double-edged sword, and that it's rather understandable then that there was a lot of brakes on the development of multicellularity, and it had to overcome a lot of obstacles to get to the point where you start having the big multicellularity surges way farther down the road on this. So what is the intelligent design explanation alternative? You'd like to know, and so would I, because they can't work this out. I'm going to put in a little quote in the description as well about Gertrude Stein. She was once asked about her hometown of Oakland, California, and her view of it is there is no there, which is just a ruthlessly nasty thing. You might say almost the same thing about Tacoma versus Seattle, and there are a lot of towns that are like that. I think Buddha and Pest might have a debate about that, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but certainly Oakland versus San Francisco. And that's the problem in a nutshell with the intelligent design movement. Because unlike young Earth creationists, intelligent designers don't have a model. They have an anti-model, not Darwinism and naturalism and all of that. And all of their apologetics, 100% of it, is just what we're getting from this Uncommon Descent. It's here's a technical paper and here's a thing which is raising a problem and there's all these question marks. Well, what's your model? Intelligent design has never worked out a model. Not in the 1990s when the intelligent design movement was starting on the field, and right down to the present. They have only an anti-model, which puts them way behind our plucky gang at the young Earth creationists, who jump off the high dive into the empty pool, but at least they take the plunge. They try, because they have a ludicrously absurd model, flood geology, which has continents moving around and coal seams forming rapidly, and ice age singular happening super duper fast, and super fast speciation, and a whole bunch of things all going on at the same time. And somehow or other, heat is being dissipated from accelerated radioactive decay. And they've just got a laundry list of stuff that must have gone on in their model that they are thrashing around like a decaying carp on the beach, because they can never make the things work, but they're trying at least to defend a kind of explicit model, which can never get too accurate or too detailed because it immediately snags up on the facts. But what's so annoying about the intelligent design movement is they never get to that model stage. We have no clue how any intelligent designer, how many design events do they think happened? When? What would a design event look like? How could you tell? How many were there during the Mesozoic? How many were there during, was any of the things going on during the Great Oxidation Event a design event or not? They don't think about it. And so a lot of the issues that perplex young Earth creationists, particularly around figuring out how many kinds there are, literally don't bother intelligent designers because they don't care. So most of them don't accept common ancestry. Jonathan Wells and Steve Meyer and that crowd. A couple allegedly do. Michael Denton, who is one of the rare agnostics in the anti-evolution movement, and Michael Behe, who is a very conservative Roman Catholic. He sort of accepts speciation and common ancestry, but not really. And that's because when you actually read their books, no, they're not. There's boundary layers where they're thinking that something exceeds common ancestry aspects, but you can never quite get them to pin down what the hell they think that is because they never think it through. And I will at least give Nathaniel Jensen points for chutzpah in making a kind of specific set of claims. Not a lot, but he does make a few. Lisa asks, comments that Kenny thinks falls for every conspiracy. Think COVID vaccine is a conspiracy. Let me look up because I do. Let me look up my little references here. I got them on the other computer. The one advantage of running off a laptop, and then I've got my main PC running independently, but I just don't have an internet connection on it because I unplug it and plug it into this so that I don't have difficulties. So Hornrickson down in here. Or Henriksen, what is his little name again? By the way, it's 90 degrees in here, and I could practically want to melt. What the hell? I need to look up here to find his stupid little name. Hornrickson, yeah. I thought I had a listing in here for him. Horn. Oh, I may be having misspelled. Let me see. Pay no attention to the man typing on his computer. Oh, there we go. There we got him. He's commented on other videos. Aaron, Raw, and Jackson had a chat that he commented on that. Let's see what I got in my notes. He's a young Earth creationist. He thinks the Ica stones are real. I guess he's a Kent Hovindista, and he doubts space and NASA, so he might be a flat earther, yeah. And by all means, Kenny, please tell us what you think is happening. Oh, Lisa, yes, you're in about the same boat that I am. It's going to be kind of hot for the weekend, and then it's cooling down for a while, hopefully in like the 70s, which is going to be more our normal temperature, and then it's kind of going to go back up toward 90 after a while. So it's been a real roller coaster here. We've had a little bit of wind and stuff come in that's blown a lot of the smoke from the fires away, so the air quality has improved to the point where you can go outside and not go. That's been helpful. But at any rate, so that's the bone I have to pick with the intelligent design movement. That they're, as the old physics saw goes, they're not even wrong. That they're not even wrong. They don't get to a point where they get precise on anything. When Erica had a conversation with Gunter Beckley, who is now their kind of in-house paleontologist, insect paleontology is his main area, and that he actually doesn't use those as examples very often. Supposedly, he's got some big league papers coming out on whale evolution and the like, that and even bird evolution, that if they're, as much as he's hyping them, will be really epochal, and if it's what I'm suspecting, will be a lot less than meets the eye. And we'll find out as those things come about. But when pressed as to what he thinks happens, he's very general about it. And he sounds like there's largely natural common descent evolution with something going on with God. But and then then at that point they're jumping back and talking about the origin of life, which is the starting point that they think if they can defuse that issue, they don't have to bother about all the stuff afterwards. So, Eugene, Oregon, Lisa, yes, that's you're in the same boat, kind of, and the fires down in there, and then you've got probably a high or higher incident of Trumpista loonies down in that neck of the woods as we have over here in Eastern Washington. So, whee! Isn't life fun in the 21st century? Isn't that absolutely exciting? Anyway, that map of time issue, that paper about the oxidation event is highly relevant on that, because when you look at the average anti-evolutionist, whether they're coming from a young Earth creationist position or a intelligent design position, or that little pimple group, the largely marginalized old Earth creationists, there's not a hell of a lot of them anymore, that they all have problems with map of time, which is what happened and when, and to try to get a picture in their head of what you can tell about the past from the forensic information, and the sort of things you can infer about the past from the connective dots. So we can be reasonably confident that there were no Precambrian rabbits, to borrow a cliche. It's a different kettle of fish to know what range of bacteria there were. One of the little hobby horses that I have that I'm fascinated with is the issue of, have there been bacterial lineages in that great big period from the origin of life down to 2 billion years ago, maybe later, that some of them may have gone extinct completely. And some of them may have left zero traces in any extant organism, even by lateral gene transfer. Others might have left bits and pieces of them. And I'm wondering whether or not that would include mitochondria, which is why it's been so tough to try to figure out which early bacterial group the mitochondria developed from. Isn't it possible that they developed from a form that's now extinct? And so all we're seeing is the remnant group. When you come down way later, when cyanobacteria are being incorporated into plant cells, which already have mitochondria, by the way, that in the ancestors of plants, and become chloroplasts, there's no doubt whatsoever what they are. They're definitely cyanobacteria. But the squishiness of trying to work out what that is with the mitochondria suggests that we may be dealing with an extinct element. And given the amount of time frame involved, we may have been thrown off a bit by forgetting that because bacteria are little teeny squishy organisms, that they might not be going through as big a set of branching speciation events and possibly even mass extinction events as climate and things shift over very long periods of time, as continents are moving around. All of this is happening down in the seas. There's very little activity going up on the land at that time, although there are possibilities that there would be some bacterial things invading the land well in advance of larger organisms, which didn't exist at that time. But because they're not showing up as a fossil record, we can't track that. And as I think any scientific mind will be just as frustrated with that lack of trackability as a historian is when they're trying to deal with uncertain historical questions, because we don't have the data. We can't resolve them. And this occurs all over the place. The irreducible complexity ignores the possibility that each component has purpose on its own, and that in its current formation is now doing something that's perhaps quite a bit different from what the original systems did. And that's that whole idea of spandrels and co-option and exaptation that played such a role in the thinking of Stephen Jay Gould and also Lynn Margulis, although she, I think, pressed it often in a little bit, she was a bit too bacteriocentric for her own good. She was even thinking speciation in vertebrates was largely an endosymbiotic thing, and that never really caught on. It just didn't fit up with that, but that's not really her field. She was sort of venturing out of her wheelhouse on that. But it's looking like the whole problem with irreducible complexity, and Michael Behe is an exemplar here, how we've seen the goalposts being moved over time, is that the original irreducibly complex examples, they haven't disappeared completely from their rhetoric, but they're not playing as big a role than now, because Behe's just moved the goalposts. So now he's talking about things like mutation rates in chloroquine resistance in bacteria as somehow a line in the sand to be able to somehow defuse and get rid of thinking about things like the reptile mammal transition. That was the point of his 2007 book. That's like, whoa, peculiar. But the idea that the flagellum is a perfectly fine example of this is that it looks like the core system in the flagellum. Remember, the flagellum, there's a bunch of different flagella, by the way. There's a type 1 and a type 2 and a type 3 and all of that. So that's another complicated thing. And they're all probably independently developed. But the one particular flagellar system that has gotten so much of the bit that Michael Denton brought up originally in the 1980s, and then Michael Behe went overboard on it in his 1996 stuff on, has a spinning filament made of flagellum, and it's called the flagellum as a consequence. And so it's got rotating systems to it, which is something that nature does very rarely. There are systems that turn like a generator kind of thing, and this is one of them. And so scientists have been working out. By the way, Behe was not one of those researchers, although there is some guy, one of the rare instances of somebody actually doing work in the field about which they're pontificating, and that would be, yipes, the name suddenly just escapes me. I'm suddenly thinking of Steve Mnuchin, who was the secretary of under Trump. Starts with an M. I'll have to think of it eventually. Anyway, he's down at the University of Idaho, and he's Scott Minnick. He actually does do flagellum research. He's not one of the super duper heavy hitters in the field, but nonetheless, he's actually publishing stuff on the subject. And if you can look up his material online and all that. I think most of it is available somewhere. And he pops around as kind of trying to end run. We discussed him a little bit in The Rocks Were There because he was trying to do some banging against the Lenski long-term mutation experiments, and he was kind of overstating the case on that one. But anyway, only now are we starting to piece together a lot of the components and what precursors there possibly are on them. The molecules that actually cause it to turn down in the lower part have homologies with other systems that do other things. The major part of it that makes the flagellum, it squirts it out and makes the long filament. The core of that is a standard, what's called a type 3 secretion system. But the fun parts come in is that the various other organisms that have a type 3 secretion system probably got it by lateral gene transfer from organisms with the flagellum. So it's not that the system didn't start out as a type 3 style of thing. It's that the extant organisms that use that got it secondarily. But nonetheless, it still functions in that role. And flagellum, the flagellum components, have utility and function. They trigger an interleukin response, for example. So one of the things that some organisms can use it as an attack vector. So it can use its little squirter to squirt flagellum in and produce a response to act as an invasion mechanism, all independent of that wiggly part. And so there are interesting elements, particularly the cap on the end of it is one of the interesting puzzles that hasn't been yet worked out as to how that developed, which allows flagellum to form that filament in low concentration. Because flagellum will form filaments like this on its own without anything attaching to it. You just dump flagellum in a bunch of goo and they'll coalesce if the concentration is high enough. what's ingenious about the system that is developed with the flagellum is that they can do that with low concentrations, and we don't yet know the resolution on that. I will suspect that as time progresses, the one who doesn't figure this out will be Scott Minnick, let alone Michael Behe and any of the others. We got a thing here. I should debate Ben from YouTube channel Uncharted X. He holds the view that the Egyptian megaliths could not have been made with bronze, copper chisels, etc. Well, la-dee-da. Apparently the ancients knew about how to do this, and in fact, modern people can do that. It wears stuff down a lot, but if you got enough manpower, and also you've got the time on your hands, an awful lot of large monument building and pyramid building, and remember this is in a relatively narrow time frame in Egyptian culture when they were going into this mode, is taking place when the Nile is in flood. So you have a huge workforce that functionally has to walk off their farm and do something. Well, you might as well have them carve stuff and haul stones around and all that stuff. You would need to be discussing which megaliths he has in mind, because, of course, a pyramid wouldn't qualify for that. You're really talking about some of the larger statuary and or the big obelisks. And there it's just a matter of banging away at it. If you do it long enough, hard enough, you can do these things. And if you have enough manpower, you can do these things. A lot of this stuff will have been built to take advantage of river systems. For example, you build a stone thing that you want to excavate, and you also work underneath it and build a raft underneath it and wait for the Nile to flood and lift the whole thing up hydraulically and cart it up to where you need it and install it. It required an enormous amount. They show illustrations of monstrously large obelisks being carried along on boats in just that way, and sledges being used to pull stuff along and all that, lubricating the way, and rollers underneath. It certainly involves enormous amounts of coordination, but cultures are good at that. I mean, have you ever seen an Olympic game where people can coordinate lots of stuff all happening at the same time? And how do they do that? How do they rehearse that? Well, that's what human beings do. And if you've got a culture that can marshal and get you into trouble if you don't, we have a similar situation dealing with the Inca and a lot of the stoneworking. Even before the Inca, there was an awful lot of really massive stoneworking, and they love building crap without mortar. So it's just trimming the stuff down precisely, and they fit with these little like jigsaw patterns, and it makes them amazingly earthquake proof. And I suspect that they had a long tradition going back, a good 1,000 years in that before the Inca culture of getting the hang of how to build structures that were functionally earthquake resistance in places that have them when the gods start rumbling every once in a while. So there are examples of like a cathedral that was built on top of the ruins of an old Inca temple, and an earthquake came along in like 1700 and something and virtually demolished the damn cathedral on top, but not the stones, because they just juggled around beautifully because they were earthquake resistant. And you get people noticing that. There's no reason to think that every culture hasn't had a population of Leonardo da Vinci class intellects. And they don't always let them come to the fore, but occasionally they will. And they will be doing ingeniously clever stuff and doing amazing things. On a little bit of a political side, yeah. Some people have too much ideology on their hands. They should just shut the F up. I think it's perfectly reasonable that people, gymnastics and others are immensely mental focused things. You have to get into an incredible headspace that's far more complex, because you're moving at enormous speed, and any mistake you do, you can break your bloody neck. And the idea that when you're not in the right headspace, that you just should pull back not be having to worry about pushing yourself on this. And in previous Olympics, you had things where they would just give them an injection of something to get them all hopped up, and we find this with the Russians and Eastern Europeans that were doing a lot of that stuff. I'm sure it's gone on in some other cultures in that as well that have that kind of streak. But no, it's first of all, it's just an effing Olympic Games, and the things that I find most encouraging about it are the athletes that actually behave like Olympians, that when somebody falls down, one of their compatriots from a completely different country helps pick them up, or that there's genuine sympathy when somebody from one team from a different country has failed, but they gave it their best shot, and they're being human about it. That, to my mind, is a true Olympian spirit. And so anybody of these others that are trying to criticize Simone Biles or anybody else on this, should just recalibrate their brain and start figuring out what all this is supposed to be about. And you're missing the boat here, kids. So get in contact with any of those on debates. Unfortunately, so many of the debaters that I debate never want to debate me again, or they want to do so under conditions that are trying to deck stack their framework. Nephilim Free, for example, will not discuss source methods with me. He will not discuss what his detailed theory is. He wants to have a generic naturalism, natural selection is wrong, blah, 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 where he can just spew out the same rhetorical blips and PowerPoint slides that he's been churning out all the way along. And he doesn't want to explore the content of the thing. So on that respect, you get into a little conundrum. I doubt I'll ever have an opportunity to debate Kent Hovind again, because I would want to discuss more about his absolutely appalling source methods and why he's such a secondary source addict, and what does he think he's doing when he assembles a PowerPoint and he is pulling up some junk from some old stuff he got from Walt Brown, and does even the tiny glimmer of a thought go through his head? Maybe I should check up whether or not a thing that I'm getting from an old 2000 source about something that's dated 1975, that there might be something else I'd need to know about it in the decade since. Does that even cross his fog bank scope? I don't think it does, frankly, but it would be interesting to look into, in the same way that it would be just fascinating because they're so temperamentally similar, Kent Hovind and Donald Trump, to have a source methods analysis of what Donald Trump thinks. And does he believe much of any of what he says, versus is he just cravenly making all sorts of stuff? Historians will want to know. And since he stupidly became our employee as president of the United States, he forgets that now it's permanent. We own all of our presidents forever. The moment you get sworn in, you're ours. Woo. Talk about involuntary servitude. You're the historian's baby forever. And everything you've ever done is our interest. We want to know, if we get down to the point of finding out what toilet paper you used and how much you farted during a day, we're going to want to know that, because that's what we do as historians. And so the moment he became our employee as president, I want to know what the hell's going through his head. Does he believe what he says or not? And on this big lie claptrap that he's still fomenting, from a practical point of view, I can entirely understand why he does what he does. Trump never admits error, just as Kent Hovind never admits error. And so he must always have been correct. Plus, even before he became president, he was insisting that he couldn't lose an election. So had he lost the 2016 election, he would have cried foul, just like he did in 2020. And so all of that is just the behavior that he had already established prior to that time. But then there's also greed, because he owes a lot of money and he's got financially limiting things because he's not a very good businessman, and his revenue streams have been shrinking constantly all through this period. He's had a bunch of his projects, the big golf courses, have been money pits, tens of millions of dollars a year he's had to funnel in from. This is all, I'm not making this up. This is stuff that Forbes magazine and various people that follow his finances are able to deal with that. And the Don Giovanni, that's the 2020 election, not the 2000 election. A different president lost the 2000 election. At any rate, that was another little funky little bit. But there's an incentive that Donald Trump has. This is where you start applying source methods and analysis of things, that he has a financial incentive to sustain this big lie claim. Why? Because he gets money. He has already raised millions of dollars in campaign financing to fight the fight for the midterms. Problem is that so far he doesn't seem to be spending any of it on any of that. And this could actually get him into trouble with the election commissions, because some of that's maybe illegal. And I'd just love to see him get into further trouble on this, in the same way that there's a good case to be made that Ivanka Trump and Jared have broken some laws in how they fund money around. But the point is that all of that big lie steal campaign as well, he wanted to get as much money, and the Republican Party wanted to get as much money out of that as they could to pay off campaign debt. And what was so craven about it is there was a little footnote at the bottom of the donate bit that said, oh, by the way, if your money donation is below a certain point, this is going into the GOP general fund to pay off campaign debt, not to look into election fraud. And so once you had those little footnotes in there, Trump and the GOP have every incentive to try to bilk their constituents for as much money as they can. And in case of Trump, he will try to bilk the Republican Party for as much as he can. And if they let him do it, they deserve to go down the rabbit hole with him. I don't think it's going to stave off his bankruptcy in the general end of it, because he's just got too much. He's burned too many bridges. Before, he could always fill up the coffers by borrowing more money. But all of his bank defaults have limited the number of bankers that would be willing to do that. And it finally reduced down functionally to Deutsche Bank in Germany that would loan to money launderers. They have a very shady reputation. But he's even lost his connection there. So where does he get new money from? Well, ka-ching, from gullible Republicans who will buy the little MAGA hats and send in their $5 and $10. And if enough of them do that, that piles up into, I think he's raked in about 85 million. How much of it is that he's going to actually be able to glom onto personally, and whether or not he's going to run into some election law fraud to do it, we'll see. So it's going to be very, very exciting. Just keep in mind some numbers. Sorry about this extended rant on the Trumpism, but it's exactly the same methodology that you deal with another personality type just like him, which is Kent Hovind. So pay in mind the fact that of the $1.1 billion that Trump owes, 890 million of that comes due by 2024. And that means the next couple of years. So it's going to be funky to see how he's going to raise money to be able to deal with that. And that's independent of whether he can scrape up money to pay for various lawsuits that are coming on down the stream. His niece Mary is suing the family and him for cheating her side of the family out of inheritance when Daddy Fred died, and so forth and so on. And then you've got potential tax benefits that he may have to give back. There's hundreds of millions of dollars in there. And so it's a funky little opportunity. There's a lot of numbers running around. Plus, he's got greedy heirs who aren't going to like adults who may get involved in trying to scramble for the money that they can. And he's got Melania, who may be figuring out when she wants to file the divorce papers. And I'm hoping she waits one day too late and eventually gets nothing on it. So Lisa thinks he'll be in prison in 2024. I'm not sure about that. He's a very resilient huckster, and he's been able to avoid even convictions. He will settle out of court for money. But then again, if he runs out of money, he may not be able to pull off that trick. I have no objections to Trump going to prison, but that's not the primary thing that you need to have happen to him to really give his comeuppance. Because like Kent Hovind spent a decade in prison and it didn't make him contrite. He's just the same son of a bitch now as he was before. Trump would be exactly the same way. No, what Trump has to lose is what he values, which is his bling and his money. If he has to sell Trump Tower at a loss, if he has to sell Mar-a-Lago at a loss, if he has to sell the Turnberry golf course that he bought for $60 million under the expectation that it was going to be used for the British Open, and the British Open won't go there because he owns it now, that suddenly if he has to sell that and take a bath on it and loses everything he built as his family tries to rip him apart for whatever he can get, then that will be a punishment. Then on top of which, if he ends up in jail in an orange jumpsuit, fine and dandy. But if he knows that when he comes out of the jail that he's got nothing, zip. He's just Mr. Nobody who used to be a rich person who, if he wants to see Trump Tower without the name on it, what will it be? Bezos Tower? Will it be Bloomberg Tower? Who will buy the tower? And what he would be like Selfridge, who lost control over the department store there in Britain and spent his later years in threadbare old suits, walking to the corner and looking at the department store he had founded 15 years or so earlier, and he can't even go inside, and they don't want him there, and all of that. That's the kind of thing I want for dear old Donald, and I want him to live as long as Hoover. There we go. So, well, yes, I definitely want him never to be able to run again. That's another thing. Trump is a disgrace as a president. He was a disaster as a one-term president. I never want not only him, but anybody like him ever to be president. The presidency should never be regarded as an entry-level position ever again. This is a serious, catastrophic mistake. Never has there been anybody as underqualified for the president, as temperamentally ill-suited for the presidency as Donald Trump. And in normal years, he would have been weeded out in the Republican Party mechanism before he ever even got the nomination. But all of that's broken down now. And the fact that the Republicans managed to elect him as their standard bearer, and then him getting elected president once. And remember, 10 million more people voted for him in 2020 than voted for him in 2016. That's a sobering fact and a measurement of 75 million people who really lack judgment that are still out there and voting in their local politics and state level. You think they're making any better decisions in those spots than they are otherwise? And we're going to have to deal with that as a nation. But from the point of view that anyone like Trump should never, ever be our commander in chief again, because the ability to screw stuff up. If he had gotten a second term, I would expect us to have plunged into a depression, because Democrats are pretty good at handling the economy overall. This is immeasurable. And the Republicans are pretty bad at it. And 8-year term of Republicans in the 20th and 21st century is pretty sufficient to screw things up. If you're reasonably competent, you might only screw things up mildly. So Eisenhower was a competent Republican who managed to just produce a recession, and a pretty serious one. That's one of the reasons why we have President Kennedy after that. George Bush, coming off of 8 years, managed to screw things up royally, and he only really, the shit didn't hit the fan until like the last year of his term. And you had a whole bunch of people going, oh, look at how wonderful the economy is doing, until it isn't. Harding Coolidge created the mess that led into Hoover. I don't blame Hoover for the Depression. I can blame him for not having the imagination to be able to solve the problem in the way FDR was able to over on the Democratic side. But I don't blame him for creating the mess to begin with. In the 19th century, when presidents were much less powerful than they are now, and there was much less things, you had no social security system, you had no unemployment insurance, you had a whole bunch of safety net things that didn't exist, and the government had relatively little power to be able to do stuff. There was no Federal Reserve. There was a whole bunch of tools that didn't exist back in the 19th century. It was possible to screw the economy up in one term. And it happened as well. And in the old days, it was even a kind of a not party-based. You had Democrats who were stupid idiots, and you had Republicans who were stupid idiots. But now it's turned into a thing where the really bad economic policies are almost exclusively Republican. And this is a sad thing to see with the party of Abraham Lincoln, But so long as you've got the Trumpista wing functionally controlling this party, that's the most you can ever see out of it. So, yes, want to see him become president of a prison glee club. Oh, but my gosh, do you ever want him to hear him sing? No, I don't think so. So, we're a little past the hour. Any fine little questions? I apologize for the little sidebar on the politics and history of it, because but history is my thing. And I've not been quiet about my distaste for what's happened to a party I used to be able to vote for, the Republicans. And I have a great deal to admire about an awful lot of Republicans historically, but not the bunch that's been coming along in the last 20 and 30 years, and certainly not the Matt Getzes and the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the dervish, sycophantic, whirling dervish Lindsey Grahams and suck-up types of that ilk that are spineless jellyfish on here. Have they no principles at all? Apparently not. So Trump is acting as a measurement stick, just in the way that Kent Hovind is. Anybody that takes Kent Hovind seriously, instantly you know they cannot be taken seriously, because if they had judgment, they couldn't do that. Donald Trump is in exactly that same mode. Anybody that thought Donald Trump was a good idea to be president lacks judgment, and anybody who still supports him today, whoop, instantly are showing that they're a threat to the republic. And you got to make sure they never get into power, although some of them will in certain districts. And so we'll see what happens in the midterms. We'll see Republicans are hell-bent to gerrymander and voter suppress their way to retake the House. Kevin McCarthy wants to be Speaker of the House. No. Yeah, bad idea. And the like. And so it's going to be an interesting midterm next year, and yet another one a couple of years down the road when we find out whether or not Mr. Trump still has the wherewithal to be able to run for president, or whether his shit has finally hit his fan and he's too busy trying to scramble to find a place to live now that he's had to sell everything off. We'll find out. Anyway, from the 90-degree plus Spokane, Washington, Jackson and I have been here. We would have been jawing a little bit more about the material that we're doing on our various sections of the book. With a little luck, by later in the year or early 2022, we should be able to get our second volume out, and it will be just as pithy and informative and information laden as volume one. And we're keeping at it as long as I can. Tell everybody that you know about the project. If you're a patron of the project, explain in social media why you are, and if you can get some of them to help as well. Every little bit counts. I mean, you know, a $1 donate and $5 donate or $10. I mean, we're not talking about having to hawk the house to do any of this stuff. You know, I don't want anybody to do that. But if you have a little bit of spare cash on hand to provide that steady support, just like PBS and these other things that have to do this same route, I always put the links to all of that stuff and the places where you can get any one of the books. I don't put Paralogs of Fog in there, but you can find that on Amazon. But the two science ones you can find in there. Help out and spread the word. So till next week. And if you aren't vaccinated, get vaccinated. If you are running around people that aren't vaccinated, maybe stay away from them. COVID is turning dark in Florida at Nincompoop DeSantis down there. And this is a death cult that's making the recovery. Here, we're going around without masks and things on because we've got pretty much under control. I carry my little mask around with me. I'm vaccinated, so if I need to put my mask on, I'm not worried about that. But we've got nutballs over in Idaho, and things can run out of control in a hurry because the virus doesn't give a rat's ass what your politics is. So apply reason and decency, and if you know people who haven't, try to nudge them in the direction of getting vaccinated, and call attention to the number of people who regret the fact that they've gotten into COVID or died because of it, because they didn't take this seriously enough. This is now that we have vaccines, any further deaths in this area is due to negligence. The negligence of not getting vaccinated is not because healthcare workers or the government or the manufacturers of the vaccine are not doing their part. There it is. So everybody stay careful, stay safe, try to enjoy yourself, don't make a nuisance, and see you next week.